Well, Douglas, we're having a conversation now following our, I think we can safely call it a successful workshop that we held the other day. Um, Douglas, do you want to mention what the workshop was?
It was fun. We had the luxury of 3 hours online with about 30 organization development professionals, who are part of an informal network called Odin. And we worked with them on two things, really. One was experientially in small groups, sharing experiences of when the obvious had changed for each of us, professionally or personally, and just trying to notice what kind of connections that help make between us. And then secondly, just starting to lead from those ideas of working with changes in the obvious to bigger societal issues like meritocracy.
So I suppose we have a bit of a conversation now about what struck us as being, what became obvious for us in that workshop on the obvious, if it doesn't sound too convoluted. So I don't know, what became obvious for you? I mean, I've got some thoughts about it, but yeah, what became obvious for you?
Well, one thing that I wasn't anticipating at all was just simply, I mean, we were both voluntary spare parts in that we wanted small groups of 3. I seem to remember from maths that not every number is divisible by 3. But it meant that we were sort of in a small group for part of it, and we tried some of the sharing, and there came a silence in the group. And we're all organization development professionals or groupies thereof, so we're all accustomed to a degree to sitting with silences in a face-to-face encounter. But I noticed or imagined that when there was just a silence fell on the small group in the Zoom context, there seemed to be a heightened level of anxiety. And indeed, one of the organizers of Odin said something like, "I hope one of the two of you is going to say some answers," or something like that, which I thought was really interesting, coming from someone who would understand about working with silence. And so the thing that I'd not anticipated but suddenly was obvious is that how you do silence on Zoom is different from how you do it in real life. And I've had 1 or 2 thoughts about why that might be, but that was the experience.
I think that's really interesting, and the quality of silence is different, isn't it? And particularly when you see, we had 30 people there, so when you see 30 people looking at you, it does feel different as opposed to say being in a circle or whatever.
I wondered whether, thinking about it afterwards, one of the things that's different is that because of technology, any video conferencing tool can freeze. So when you're looking and no one's saying anything, you've got a question which you don't normally have in real life, which is whether in fact it's an intentional silence, or whether in fact something's frozen and you're actually cut off from a group conversation that's continuing. That doesn't normally happen in real life. And I was thinking about how we could test that to, if like, I suppose if you were on Zoom and you're holding an intentional silence, maybe if you made continuous, so everyone could see that your screen hasn't frozen. That's enough of that.
I think for me,
what for you?
I think for me, what I came to realise more vividly than I had noticed before, that perhaps making the obvious is the day job, really. So so I'm involved in leadership, management, development, and there are very few neat answers in that field. So in the absence of neat answers, all we can do is to develop a better question. And I guess for me, the making the obvious more obvious is a great way of trying to make a better question. So, you know, if you're using, I don't know, action learning or coaching or whatever technique you're trying to use, enabling people to see their obvious is the stock in trade of the work.
I wonder if is there anything from your work or from your teaching where you thought, well, I might try something a bit different there, or think about trying something a bit different there to in form of a better question?
Say that again.
I just wondered whether, in relation to any concrete bits of work or things you've got coming up in the next few months, whether this idea, this thing that struck you about a better question, is beginning to acquire the concreteness of saying, oh, I might try something a bit different with that group.
Not quite yet. But last year I came up with a metaphor of working with groups. So instead of, it's a metaphor of foraging as opposed to following breadcrumbs, and the idea of developing an inquiring group where we're all as part of an endeavour to try to find something out. That's quite different from the expert in front of the class, spouting out knowledge. And I've worked with that an awful lot. That's not to say that the expert isn't important. The expert is really, really important, but so is that contextual application and working with that knowledge.
Something which, sorry.
Sorry, Douglas. Well.
No, something which struck me from the workshop, which in a way ought to have been more obvious to me before, but really only became obvious during the workshop. In fact, during the bit that you led, when you were talking about other ways than Pierre Bourdieu's of thinking about the obvious, it became obvious to me the connection between Bourdieu's logic of practice, which, as you know, is at the core of my doctorate, and is quite a micro, for Bourdieu, by Bourdieu's standards, quite a micro thing, to his much more famous stuff, which is about macro-social stuff, about like class and social distinction. One of his famous books, his famous book called The State Nobility, and another very famous book, Distinction, really his life's work about these macro-social hierarchies. And I very much felt that that was above my pay grade. But I would gratefully use his tools around the logic of practice to worry away at my stuff. But actually, when you were talking about other ways of, as in action learning, for example, of thinking about the obvious, or Chris mentioned de Bono, one of the advantages of Bourdieu is he's done a lot to help us get from that more micro focus to see that there could be connections to larger patterns like meritocracy or glass ceilings in society. And
I think what was really interesting from this the session was that the focus was on meritocracy and elites, and that was the sort of the nub of the exploration. But making the obvious sort of obvious and exploring that is, perhaps the root of most inquiry. I was Reg Revins, Peter Checklin, Michael Poliani, that work with these topics. All of them have one thing in common, that but they work in science and they work at the edge of knowledge where they don't have the answer. All they scrabble around with is trying to get a better question and using each other as a way of actually trying to develop their own better insights into their own question. And for me, that was a bit of a revelation, I think.
My first degree was in mathematics. I was a pure mathematician, and I remember a very famous, it's kind of hackneyed joke about the obvious that mathematicians would tell each other, usually about some apocryphal professor standing in front of a class, going through a theorem. And at a certain point in the argument, he wants to take a step from proposition 1, let's call it, to proposition 2, which he claims is a deduction from proposition 1. And he declaims to the class, and that step's obvious, i.e. there's no need to do any detailed, anyone with a brain should be able to. But then, for some reason, doubt enters his mind, or maybe he's asked a question by the class. And so he pauses and frowns and turns back to the blackboard, because we're definitely in blackboard and chalk era, and spends the next half an hour scribbling to himself, like in that film, The Beautiful Mind, equation after equation as he works through the steps. And then he finally turns around with satisfaction after half an hour and said, yes, it is obvious. I knew it was. And he satisfied himself that his deduction was correct, not just that it was correct, but that it was obvious.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point to draw us to a conclusion.
Right. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for working with me on the workshop.
All right. Thank you, Douglas.